Hey guys, tonight we slip into a room so dim the rushes on the floor look like a slow stream, and the hearth hums like a well-fed cat that has memorized every psalm. You stand in the doorway and breathe bread warming toward crust, damp wool easing itself dry after a quiet rain, and rosemary tucked into the rafters to keep away more than moths. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're awake enough, post your location and the local time. I love seeing the constellation of night owls across the map. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move along the longhouse beam that has absorbed a century of smoke, your fingertips learning the grain like old music. Tonight you're here to feel how love and sex share this space with pottage, psalms, and muddy boots. How desire doesn't crash into the day so much as settle into it, like another log added to a steady fire. Historians still argue whether the typical medieval marriage is mainly an economic alliance stitched by kin and property, or an affectionate partnership that just happens to keep the cow counted as a bonus. And the truth is that the ledger and the heart take turns holding the quill. On the table, a hot loaf crackles like tiny thunder. A child yawns, a dog thumps the floor with a hopeful tail, and a cloak steams gently by the hearth. Love here is not loud, it is durable. The mini-thesis line for this section: in the medieval home, sex and love are part of the ordinary rhythm of worship, work, and weather, not separate fireworks, but a warm ember everyone tends together. A mainstream historical fact enters with the evening. In much of medieval Europe, marriages are publicly announced through bans, 3 Sundays of church notice, so impediments can surface, and a union becomes a communal promise as much as a private vow. Consent matters in canon law. 2 people's mutual "I will" is the core. But the village expects those words to harmonize with kin obligations, dowries, and land, which means the priest's voice rings across the nave while a few neighbors quietly mouth, "Well, that explains those eggs changing baskets." The couple whose banns were read last Sunday sits with bowls of pottage, trading the soft glances of people inventorying a shared future. Hay in the loft, a cough in February, a joke folded into a hard day to keep it from cracking. Desire is here, sex comes to the table like another course, but it's seasoned with patience, timing, and the knowledge that the house is not as soundproof as romance poetry suggests. Privacy is a curtain, not a wall. When the curtain sways, someone coughs, very politely, in the far bed. That's the medieval version of headphones. Remember our promise about courtship signals later. You already noticed the choreography, the tilt of a veil, the way a glove is drawn off a finger-by-finger beat, the passing of a bowl with an extra brush of knuckle that could be an accident or a paragraph. These codes don't vanish when vows are said. They translate into a married grammar of tenderness. Your first light joke of the night, medieval texting, is basically a longer sleeve and a meaningful cough. A curious tidbit: in some homes, a sprig of rue or fennel tucked near the door is said to keep envy outside and short tempers from climbing higher than the rafters. A matching sprig above the bed smooths quarrels and encourages, as one neighbor delicately claims, cooperative sleep. Is it charm or aromatherapy with a marketing department? Historians still argue whether these household rituals are remnants of older belief or just practical herbs wearing a whisper of sanctity. But either way, the room smells kindly. The day's schedule is also a map of desire. Dawn hauls the household awake: water, animals, dough, and by nightfall, the body wants rest and sometimes closeness. The liturgical calendar hums like a metronome. Feast days and fast days, seasons when meat is out, fish is in, and there are times when sex is frowned upon or set aside for prayerful quiet. Rules suggest. People negotiate. You know the drill from modern life. Sometimes the calendar loses arguments with the weather and the heart. In a corner, the bed waits. Maybe a carved frame with curtains, maybe straw dressed with wool. It is precious furniture, both stage and sanctuary. The house's soundtrack is layered. Hearth pop, distant snore, a pot settling with a single cluck, all of it the white noise of ordinary intimacy. Sex here isn't a separate event. It's woven into the cadence of domestic life, adjusted for seasons, harvests, and the degree to which your neighbor snores like a minor saint with a major cold. A clear mainstream fact tucks itself in. By the high medieval period, the Church recognizes marriage as a sacrament, enfolding domestic affection and sexual union inside liturgy and blessing. This doesn't erase the economics, it wraps them in. Candles and vows gives couples words that sanctify both companionship and conjugal life. The sanctity doesn't make the pottage less salty, but it gives the salt a proverb. Humor slips in with its boots off. If medieval couples had a love languages poster, acts of service would be, I hauled water before dawn. Quality time would be, we shell peas side by side. Gift giving is a new wooden spoon that only splinters occasionally. Words of affirmation is your stew is 12% less smoky than last week. And physical touch is, we share the only pair of warm socks like diplomats. The dog, acting as peer reviewer, wags approval. You'll hear later about licensed brothels and moral regulation, but you already sense the boundary. Home is the respectable sphere, where sex belongs in marriage encouraged for procreation and mutual comfort, and tidiness of reputation keeps the door latched against gossip. Historian debates persist. Historians still argue whether pastoral writers consistently endorsed mutual pleasure within marriage, or tolerated it as an unavoidable side effect of procreation. But the pragmatic tone of many confessional manuals suggests at least a pastoral patience with people who live together and like each other. By now the chores are done, and the couple moves toward the curtained corner. You give them privacy, because second-person narration still knows how to be third-person polite. The village has already witnessed the marriage. It will not witness the tenderness. Yet the community remains present in the gentle creaks of the house and the foxjack before bed. Your second light joke glides past. Romance here includes going out to count chickens at midnight because the foxes, regrettably, observe office hours. Curious tidbit tiptoes in. In some places, people rest a small token under the pillow. A coin, a ribbon, a tiny holy charm to invite peaceful dreams and smoother mornings. Maybe it's folklore, maybe devotion, maybe just the comfort of remembering something small and kind waits by your head in the dark. Historians still argue whether such habits reflect a mingling of sacred and secular hopes or simply human fondness for stacking the odds. But the pillow doesn't mind. It keeps the secret. Mainstream fact, domestic edition. The legal concept of coverture will in time shape a wife's formal economic voice in many regions, how property is managed, how contracts are made, though practice varies widely by class and locality. Even so, household negotiations can be surprisingly specific. Who keeps the key to the chest? Who tallies eggs? Whose call is final when weather threatens the barley? Love and sex are not exempt from the ledger. They are the ledger's warm margins. Remember the banns, our earlier echo. Those public words make a private room sturdier. The village expects affection to coexist with responsibilities, and affection usually obliges. When two tired people meet under a wool blanket in winter, the blanket is not only fabric, it is a treaty. A treaty that occasionally includes a clause about cold feet. Your third light joke arrives on cue. Nothing disrupts medieval passion like discovering your partner's toes are basically small, determined icicles with opinions. The evening slows. The hearth eye dims to a drowsy red. Somewhere beyond the shutter, a night bird asks a question it never expects answered. The couple leans into quiet, and you can almost sense how their desire has learned the house's timing, the way it waits for the door bar to settle, the dog's sigh to deepen, the last embers crack to finish. Historians still argue whether peasant households enjoyed more freedom in arranging intimate life than urban ones with guild oversight. Evidence is uneven because records are most vivid when something goes wrong and lands in a court book. You step outside the mine's door for a breath. The stars look like someone spilled flour on a dark board, and the lane smells of damp earth and stable hay. When you step back in, the room has cooled by a whisper. On the table, tomorrow's tasks sit ready like friendly instructions. Kindling stacked, bucket by the door, a mended glove curved into the shape of a hand already reaching. This preparedness is love too. It keeps sex from floating off as an isolated spark and anchors it to the safe harbor of a shared life. One last curious tidbit for the room. There are households where bread spends the night on the pillow and returns to the table at dawn, carrying peace from bed to board. It's superstition if you like, sacrament if you prefer, but mainly it's gratitude you can butter. Historians still argue whether such gestures are theological poetry or kitchen magic pretending to be liturgy. Your stomach votes in favor either way. You take in the scene's final softness. No fanfare, no balcony. The home's grammar is simple: do the work, say the prayer, share the stew, share the bed. Here, sex is affectionate, scheduled around saints and seasons, sometimes. Delayed by chores, sometimes ignited by a joke whispered under the blanket, always braided with survival. The mini-thesis hums again so you don't forget it. Medieval love is domestic craftsmanship, and sex is one of its most carefully tended tools, ordinary, necessary, warmly human. The house exhales. The curtain stirs. The night tucks itself in. You keep the glow of this hearth as a guide for the path ahead, toward calendars that choreograph closeness, penitentials that try to supervise it, marketplaces and songs that reframe it, knowing we're staying with the same two hands, the same two hearts, moving through the same soft dark. You step into a corridor of moving fabric and polished wood, where the air carries violets, beeswax, and the innocent squeak of new shoes trying to impress old floors. You are in a world that treats love like embroidery. The pattern is prescribed, but the pleasure is in the small deviations you alone will notice. Here, courting with gloves and glances is a sport of patience, and sex, yes, we'll say it when it fits, is a private destination mapped by public detours. Your eyes adjust to candlelight as a harp plucks two notes and then thinks better of a third. You are not late to the party. You are right on time to see how a look becomes a plan. A mainstream historical fact arrives with the music. In aristocratic courts across medieval Europe, the poetry and practice of courtly love develop as a high-status pastime, codified by manuals, celebrated in troubadour and trouvère lyric, and consistently performed in spaces where actual marriages are arranged for property, peace, and power, not for love. The social paradox is intentional. A married lady may be the poetic object. The suitor may not be her husband. Virtue is tested, not toppled, at least on parchment. Meanwhile, in towns and villages, more practical courtship customs weave through fairs, church porches, and household visits, where supervision is a feature, not a bug. Your mini-thesis for this section is simple and steady. Medieval courtship runs on signals, veils, gloves, gifts, songs, and public rituals, allowing desire to exist safely in plain sight, while the community and the calendar quietly referee the pace. In other words, the street sees everything and confirms nothing, a talent it has kept into the present. You watch a gloved hand hover at the edge of a bow, and you note the choreography. A glove becomes a manuscript. Color speaks, stitching whispers. The way it is removed announces a sentence you either understand or pretend not to. A single glove carried at a feast can suggest a heart, half bared, while a pair bound with ribbon functions like a miniature promise. You mustn't stare at the fingers. That S considered a bit like reading a letter over someone's shoulder. Your first light joke for this stretch. If medieval flirting had red receipts, they'd be the crease on a glove and the speed of a curtsy. Historians still argue whether the codes of courtly love meaningfully influenced ordinary people's wooing, or were mostly the cosplay of elites. Evidence drifts in from songs, sermon complaints, and the occasional court record describing overmerry dancing. But regardless of class, the signaling game persists. At market, a length of ribbon dropped beside a stall might become a souvenir. At a church porch, a shared psalm book puts two heads under one line of text. A look held 2 seconds too long is a thesis defense with no faculty in sight. You remember the hush and hearth from section 1, the bands echoing through the nave, and see how those public announcements are prepped by quieter steps. Before bands, there is visiting. You walk out with a friend's chaperone attached, like punctuation. You help bring in hay. You carry water in a pair so you can talk without anyone pretending not to listen. And in some regions, there's a supervised version of proximity that town gossip will later escalate into legend. Yes, sex waits its turn. Desire, however, studies for the exam by borrowing notes from daily labor. A curious tidbit: in certain towns, seasonal festivals include games of naming with flowers or baked goods, where participants exchange tokens tied to riddles, solve the riddle, keep the token, and the token becomes permission to request a dance later. Is this widespread? Hard to say. Folklore loves to generalize from one field to a continent, but even if it's local, it captures the mood. Public mischief deployed to create private permission. You can almost hear the pastries plotting alliances. You notice how church time quietly directs flirtation, the way we promised it would in the last section. Feast days are permissive, fast days are reflective. After high mass on a sunny Sunday, the green outside the nave is a non-threatening marketplace of glances. Fairs add their noise, bells, drummers, cheap miracles for sale. The mill lane offers a rarer privacy, but privacy can be suspicious unless you have a sack of G. Rain as an alibi. Humor slips in, wiping its feet. The medieval equivalent of "we met at the library" is "we discussed aqueducts near the mill." Another mainstream fact, town version. Church porches serve as places for betrothal and business alike. They are sheltered yet public, perfect for promises that need witnesses. A betrothal contract might be spoken there, with coins or tokens exchanged and hands joined in front of neighbors. This is practical romance, the kind that schedules itself between matins and market. Meanwhile, in noble halls, minstrels make metaphors do push-ups to keep everyone's attention safely on allegory. You stand by a pillar's end tapestry scene and watch a troubadour perform a canso that praises a lady's virtue with enough specificity to be flattering and enough vagueness to keep the husband calmly buttering his trencher. Historians still argue whether these performances were sincere schools of self-control or winking entertainments that everyone understood as mild fiction with a moral frosting. Either way, the room practices reacting. A dim smile here, a ceremonial sigh there, and never any spilling of wine at the wrong line. The glove again, because the glove is the star today. A suitor might send a glove perfumed with civet or rosewater, and the recipient can reply by returning a sprig tucked in the cuff. Sprig up. Maybe. Sprig missing. Probably not. Sprig replaced by thread of a certain color. Now you're fluent. To modern eyes, it looks like overthinking. To this room, it is kindness, precision that protects reputations while allowing feelings to breathe. You recall the herb sprigs guarding doorways from last time and smile at the echo. Herbs secure both households and hearts. You cross into the more ordinary world again, where two people share the same lane, and the signals are simpler but no less careful. Borrowing tools, leaving extra eggs, positioning oneself in the same pew row for a month of Sundays. Your second light joke bows. The medieval, soft launch of a relationship is showing up at the same well before sunrise and pretending the water tastes different at that hour. We said we'd use the words when needed, and we will. Sexual desire sits in these encounters like a polite guest, present but not allowed to grab the bread first. Social rules, family supervision, and the very architecture of dwellings keep sex off stage until vows, or at least until significant commitments, clarify intention. Where those rules are bent, deals with consequences begin to appear in parish or manorial courts. That tension is real, and it's why courtship becomes a craft. It is safer to speak with ribbons and prayers than with doors clicking shut. A curious tidbit returns with a musical flourish. Some dance figures in late medieval sources are reputed to carry embedded flirt codes. How many steps turned outward? How often hands are released and reclaimed? Which direction a final bow faces? Dance masters of later centuries certainly codify that, whether medieval dancers used a system or simply enjoyed a tradition, is murkier. Historians still argue whether such choreographies functioned as semi-public courtship, or were just practical crowd management with an incidental shimmer of romance. Your feet, unhelpfully romantic, prefer the second theory when the music is good. The world of gifts expands. A favor might be a ribbon or a sleeve tie, a small embroidery, or a psalm verse copied neatly and folded twice. In the North, wooden love spoons appear later in history, but the impulse to carve small domestic tokens is older. A comb smoothed to a warm gloss, a spindle whorl etched with a flower, a belt clasp polished by anxious thumbs. Objects in this economy are both declarations and plausible deniability. Oh, this, just a useful thing. I happen to carry it everywhere and guard it like a relic. Mainstream fact, legal beat. Handfasting and betrothal carry weight in many regions. Promises made before witnesses can be binding, which is why a broken promise sometimes ends up in court with fines or compelled fulfillment. The Church's interest in clear, public consent pushes courtship out of shadows into ceremonies. That pressure encourages elaborate public signaling before commitments harden, so there's less risk of two people promising different versions of the future at different doorways. You remember the warmth of coals and the bread on the pillow from earlier. Courtship, too, has its household rituals. A family might invite a visitor to share a meal without seating them too near the fire. Proximity is narrative, and the room respects paragraphs. A walk in the garden is permitted if the path is visible from the window. Viewlines are moral infrastructure. Your third light joke nods its cap. Privacy is a spectrum that runs from in full view to behind a very opinionated curtain. Sex remains a promise hovering at the edge of these signals, but that edge is carefully patrolled by custom. If a pair push too far before vows, gossip accelerates like a downhill cart, and their courtship suddenly involves defenses, dour recalculations, or a very public hurrying of the banns. Historians still argue whether communities were more forgiving than sermons imply. Anecdote suggests communities often preferred solutions: marriage, support, recalibrated contracts, over punishments that created more problems than they solved. Music softens the room again. A humming chorus rises during chores, and you notice how lyrics from love songs get stitched into work tunes. The content transforms. What in court might be a lover's complaint becomes, at home, advice about baking that is definitely about love if you tilt your head. Songs do what they always do: teach rules while pretending to only amuse. A final curious tidbit for the road. Some lovers exchange small keepsakes disguised as purely devotional items: prayer beads with an extra bead that matches a friend's set, a candle stub from the same vigil, a page margin doodle shaped like a shared herb. These gestures are safer than letters, less incriminating than poems, and more durable than a glance. They make the ordinary holy and the holy ordinary, a neat trick that the whole culture approves of even when it pretends not to see. The evening closes as a door closes politely halfway. You have walked through gloves, glances, and gifts without breaking any glass, and you feel how the system holds. Public performance protects private feeling, and private feeling rewards public patience. The mini-thesis folds back over the scene. Medieval courtship is a grammar of self-control, expressed in fabrics, footsteps, and favors, so that when sex finally has its place, it arrives in a room already fluent in care. You carry forward today's signals like lanterns for the path ahead, where beds and bands and bargaining will speak even plainer, where calendars will schedule tenderness without managing to tame it, where the manuals will attempt to audit desire and discover desire has kept better records than they do. And because you came from that quiet hearth, you recognize the continuity. All these games of gesture are simply ways of saying the same sentence more safely. I like you. Let's make a life that fits. You stand at the threshold of a room the village already knows by rumor. A room with curtains you can close, but not quite silence. A room where law and laughter and longing all negotiate like merchants at a fair. Beds, bands, and bargaining. It sounds like a traveling show. And in a way it is, because the community is the audience and the chorus, and the couple are both star and stagehand. You breathe in linen that smells faintly of oak chest and summer sun, and you feel the hush of a moment that is public enough to be respectable and private enough to be tender. This is where sex takes its place after a deliberate walk through days of notice, where love is signed in a dozen practical hands, and where the bed is both furniture and forum. A mainstream historical fact steps forward with a measured bow. Marriages in many medieval Christian communities are validated by consent, mutual and present, and formalized with public rituals like the banns read on 3 Sundays, followed by vows often at the church door, where witnesses ensure that the words wait the day. The bedding that follows may be celebrated with cheerful escort, a joke or two, and a quick retreat, because the village likes to walk right up to the border of your privacy and then wave pleasantly from the other side. The public then private sequence is not a contradiction. It is a choreography designed to give a couple safety, status, and a clear beginning. You move closer to the bed, which is a statement piece if ever there was one. In wealthier homes, it stands high on carved legs, curtained to keep out drafts and public opinion. In humbler houses, it is a clean straw mattress in a curtained corner, still the best seat in the house when evening falls. The mini-thesis for this section arrives quietly but firmly. Marriage in the medieval world is a negotiation of property, kinship, consent, and sex that culminates in the bed, where affection and obligation finally meet, not as enemies, but as colleagues who understand the project is long-term and requires snacks. Remember the gloves and glances from the last section, the grammar of self-control. The same grammar runs tonight. The procession from feast to doorway to bed is deliberate. Each step carries witnesses who confirm that what begins in this room started outside with consent and community blessing. Historians still argue whether bedding ceremonies were modest gestures or rowdy invasions. Sources vary wildly by region and era. And people being people, the contrast may simply be depends on who brought the wine. Curious tidbit rustles the curtains. Some communities practiced a light-hearted ritual called the charivari. When a union looked mismatched or controversial, a noisy parade of pots and pans, teasing songs, sometimes even mock trials, meant to nudge or normalize rather than to break. In its kinder versions, it's village comedy with a moral. In rougher instances, it's pressure dressed as fun. Either way, it shows the porous wall between public approval and private rest. You can close a curtain. You can't entirely close a town. On the table, a chest sits open with documents and tokens that hum like bees. Dower agreements, dowry items, gifts from kin. A key that matters more than its size admits. Mainstream fact, legal edition. Dowry, property a woman brings into marriage. And dower, a widowed woman's life interest in a portion of her husband's estate. Structure economic security across much of medieval Europe, though terms and customs vary widely. These arrangements are the bed's accounting department. They ensure that the partnership has a floor under it, so the two people in the bed can think about comfort rather than catastrophe. Humor leans in with a wink. Nothing says sensual like a properly executed property clause and a very dignified key handoff. You hear the bands echo in memory from the nave, names spoken aloud, opportunities for objections offered and usually declined, and you sense how that public moment stretches into tonight's quiet. Consent in the medieval sense is not a whisper under linen. It is a fluent speech act, done in front of witnesses, so the private tenderness that follows can be, paradoxically, safer. Sex here does not sneak. It arrives with the authority of the morning bread. You may smile at the practicality, but your shoulders drop a little. Safety is soothing. The curtain sways, and you look away because courtesy survives curiosity. Yet the room invites you to notice the little details that make the night friendly. Clean sheets aired by the fire. A cup of warmed ale sweetened with honey. A modest lamp so the first moments are less like falling into a well and more like stepping into a small garden at dusk. If courtly love painted desire in impossible colors, married love keeps a drawer of comfortable socks, metaphorically speaking, and often literally. Your first light joke treads softly. The medieval recipe for romance features 3 ingredients: consent, clee, and linen, and someone remembering to bank the fire so nobody roasts. Historians still argue whether peasant couples enjoyed greater latitude in shaping their wedding night customs than urban or noble pairs. Records tilt toward the literate and the litigious, so we hear loudest from those whose ceremonies fascinated or troubled clerks. But pattern emerges through the noise. The public ritual creates a membrane. The community presses against it with humor. The couple learns to be kind on the inside of it. The world respects a boundary best when it helped paint the line. You watch the bargaining thread back through the day as if it has been insisting on its presence all along. Bargaining is not just haggling at a market. It is the careful calibration of expectations inside a marriage. Who rises first? Who keeps the key to the chest? Who decides when to sell a piglet? Inside the bed, bargaining becomes tenderness expressed as timing, days shaped by work, and the liturgical calendar. Moments chosen with care so sex is not a rushed footnote, but a paragraph with room to breathe. The bed is the negotiation table where nothing is written down, but everything is remembered. A curious tidbit slips in with the candlelight. In some places, friends or kin may escort the couple to the bedchamber with playful rhymes, leaving a small coin or a token under the pillow for luck. In one cheekier custom, a companion might even warm the bed by briefly lying on it first, a theatrical gesture to ensure comfort, quickly replaced by awkward bowing and quick exits. Is this everywhere? Not at all. But it tells you how humor and hope hover around the threshold, like cats who insist they were invited. Mainstream fact returns with a pastoral voice. Many penitential manuals acknowledge sexual union within marriage as licit and even good, while delineating times to abstain, fast days, certain seasons, periods following childbirth, so that bodily life reflects the rhythms of prayer and community. The result is not puritanical silence, but scheduled attentiveness. If desire is weather, the calendar offers umbrellas and picnics. Remember our earlier nod to feast and fast. Tonight you see that idea turned gently into habit, as two people learn to mesh appetite with seasons. Your second light joke arrives with a very practical expression. The medieval equivalent of setting the mood is probably closing the shutters, bribing the dog with a bone, and making sure the neighbor's goose has exited the yard. Nothing ruins a declaration of undying love like a goose who believes in due process. Now the bargaining takes one more form, the kind that lawyers only half understand. It is the bargaining of bodies learning each other's language. A pause here, a question there, sometimes a laugh, not cruel but grateful, because nerves are alive and the curtain cannot make them theater trained. This is where sex shows up as tenderness rather than spectacle, and where love decides to become patient or stubborn or both. Historians still argue whether medieval pastoral care sufficiently emphasized mutual pleasure and kindness. But in the room itself, kindness is what tends to work. Even without books, bodies find pedagogy. From the corner, the chest hums again, reminding you that the union's economics remain out in the hall even when the curtain is closed. Dower promises a floor, dowry contributes a beginning, and gifts from kin widen the walkway through the first year's narrow budgets. In that security, intimacy becomes easier to practice. Uncertainty sharpens tempers and shortens evenings. A well-run ledger, like a well-made mattress, saves arguments no sermon can prevent. A curious tidbit brightens the embers. Some regions held morning gifts customs, where a husband gives a present to his wife the day after the wedding, jewelry, a sum of money, or rights to specific property as a pledge of care. The scale varies wildly, but the meaning hums the same note. Last night was not a transaction. It was the beginning of a partnership that deserves a tangible sign at sunrise. Your third light joke drops a coin in the saucer. The surprise element is only successful if you did not already inventory every chest in the house. You remember the bread on the pillow from Section 1 and the glove signals from Section 2. The continuity is almost cozy. Bread, glove, bed, every one of them a thing you can touch, every one of them a symbol that can be read. Medieval life loves tangible metaphors because tangible metaphors survive rain, smoke, and gossip. Sex fits that pattern by staying close to objects that matter. A key, a curtain, a cup, a candle. These are not props. They are trustworthy companions that turn a nervous night into a livable habit. Mainstream fact, quick as a folded sheet. In many communities, marriage consent at the church door is followed by a blessing at the altar, gradually standardized, and then feasting, dancing, and finally the escorted farewell. The pace is designed to carry energy outward to the guests and inward to the couple, so nobody feels stranded. The feast is the community's way of lending warmth in advance. The couple repays the loan with a good morning face, and a new seating chart at the hearth. Historians still argue whether betting witnesses ever stayed too long, crossed lines, or turned custom into intrusion. Satire and scandal suggest yes, quiet memoirs, where they exist, suggest no. And the truth likely lives in that middle lane where people either behave or are politely escorted out by an aunt with a near-magical talent for appearing at exactly the right time. You breathe with the room as it slows. The curtain moves less and then not at all. Somewhere, the hearth yawns. The night, professional as ever, takes over. You respect the final thing that happens, sleep. It is not the enemy of desire. It is the friend of tomorrow. Sex is part of a marriage that wakes early and must remember how to carry hay with tenderness. In the morning, life will resume its familiar music, and the couple will join it with a new harmony that sounds like shared chores, and the private knowledge that the curtain's language is no longer foreign. Your hand trails along the curtain edge as you step back, and you hear a neighbor laugh 2 houses over, late-night jokes about roasted almonds and who spilled ale, because weddings create echo. If anyone asks how it went, the answer will be a smile and a pragmatic nod. That is a complete sentence here. It says, "We did what we promised, and we are learning how to do it kindly." The mini-thesis settles again like a folded blanket at the foot of the bed. Marriage is a negotiated blend of public ritual and private tenderness, and the bed is where the ledger and the lullaby agree to share a page. You keep that line with you as you move toward calendars that will try to choreograph intimacy with saintly punctuality, and toward manuals that will attempt to legislate desire, as if desire files forms in triplicate. Remember the goose. Remember the coin. Remember the morning gift. Practicalities persist, and affection borrows their sturdiness. On your way out, you notice one last detail you won't forget. The key to the chest now hangs on a new hook, a tiny redecoration with large meaning. Ownership is a we. Secrets are a we. Plans are a we. You step into the corridor where the feast's last cups are being stacked, where a sleepy musician rubs their wrists, where an aunt inspects the shutters with that useful magic of hers. The house resets to ordinary. Tomorrow's chores gather at the door like well-behaved geese. And the bed behind the curtain changes from stage to nest, which is the entire point. You wake to bells that don't so much ring as breathe, slow and round, like a kettle agreeing with the water. Outside, the sky is a cool slate the sun hasn't written on yet. Inside, the hearth yawns and offers a few faithful embers. You stretch, and you can feel the house's muscles. Hinges that remember yesterday, a latch with its own patience, a dog's tail testing the air like a philosophical question. Today you learn that love in this world is not a free agent. It keeps a calendar and sex. Yes, we're still using the word, sets its watch by saints and seasons. Feast days, fast days, calendars. Welcome to a schedule that does not scold desire, but asks it to be punctual. A mainstream historical fact places a finger on the page. Across medieval Christendom, pastoral teaching and penitential manuals outline days of abstinence from sex, Lent, Advent, certain vigils and fasts, the eves of major feasts, and sometimes specific weekdays, alongside periods following childbirth and before receiving communion. The exact details vary by region and era, and practice is messier than parchment, but the principle is stenciled clearly. Marital intimacy is good within marriage, and better when it listens to the drum of prayer. You notice the rhythm at once. Want is a tide, and the calendar is the moon that suggests when to go wading. You step into a lane where carts bump politely, and gossip travels at a brisk but respectable clip. People are discussing meatless meals and whether the fishmonger has achieved holiness through inventory alone. As you watch, A couple exchange a look that is part joke, part logistics. The mini thesis of this section folds itself into that glance. In medieval life, intimacy thrives not by ignoring the calendar, but by collaborating with it, turning abstinence into anticipation and feast days into a kind of permission slip with confetti in the margins. Remember the bed, the bands, the bargaining from last night. The calendar is the fourth negotiator at the same table. When markets swell in summer and harvest begs every back and thumb to help, sex often moves to quieter hours like a courteous guest, late night after the heat has lost its teeth, or early morning before the rooster remembers his lines. In winter, blankets become accomplices. In spring, fatigue plays referee. Historians still argue whether households actually adhered to the full, sometimes daunting lists of prohibited days found in stricter texts. Evidence suggests flexibility, pastoral discretion, and a shared understanding that a good rule is a fence with a gate. A curious tidbit arrives with the scent of oil and beeswax. Some households pin small tokens to their bed curtains to mark green or red times, an herb sprig for permitted days, a small ribbon knot for abstinence, which sounds like a medieval traffic light invented by someone with more charm than parchment. Is this universal? Certainly not. But it captures a domestic truth. Couples often prefer visible cues over guessing games, especially when relatives share walls thin enough to transmit arguments, but not nuance. The bells turn from breathing to singing as a saint's day approaches. Feast days are bright excuses for extra bread, for a splash of wine, for music whose chorus everyone can hum while carrying baskets. They are also times when love is easier to wear in public, hands held an extra moment under the bunting, a kiss pressed to a hairline while pretending to dust off flour. Sex does not have to show up on the feast itself. Sometimes the merriment acts like a long fuse that burns into the night after the cooking. Done, and the neighbors yawn their way home. Mainstream fact, dietary edition. Church law distinguishes between black fasts and lighter fasts, with rules about meat, dairy, and frequency of meals that change by period and place. Households adapt with fish, legumes, and a creativity that would make any modern cookbook proud. You can taste the compromise in a pot of peas comforted by herbs, and you can see how abstinent meals sometimes lead to fuller conversations. Your first light joke for the day sets a bowl on the table. Nothing says, "I love you," like a cleverly seasoned lentil pottage that doesn't pretend to be meat and also doesn't taste like penance. You walk past a scribe's bench where a small calendar, an almanac of saints and seasons, sits open to a page crowded with initials. K for a local feast, R for a market run, a tiny fish drawn by a witty nephew. The same logic lives in heads as much as in books, a mental map of days when labor slackens, when prayer grows louder, when the body is invited to rest or to rejoice. Sex, patient and practical, learns to keep step. Historians still argue whether strict enforcement of abstinent periods was common or rare. Sermons scold, but confessions, where we can glimpse them, reveal more negotiation than rebellion. Another curious tidbit steps out of a cupboard. Some couples develop household calendars beyond the liturgical one, quiet agreements like not on wool washing day or after market, never before, because exhaustion has a doctrine too, and it writes in very legible ink. These are not romantic in the troubadour sense, but they are deeply affectionate in the survival sense. It is the tenderness of saying, "I would rather you sleep now and laugh tomorrow than insist on a timetable that steals the morning." You remember the glove language from Courtship and smile at how the calendar also speaks in objects. A sprig of mint in a cup might mean a headachy day. A candle left unlit by the bed means dawn will need you early. 2 cups instead of one on the shelf could be a hopeful signal for an evening that doesn't need witnesses. Your second light joke rings like a small bell. Medieval sexting is basically setting out the second cup and pretending it's about hydration. The clergy's voice returns, pastoral rather than prosecutorial. Mainstream fact, pastoral edition. Confessors' manuals often advise moderation, mutual consent, and consideration for the spouse's health and mood, even while listing abstinent times. Threads of compassion show through the fabric of regulation more often than stereotype admits. You hear that thread every time a confessor asks not just what, but how and why, and suggests kindness as the repair for lapses. Historians still argue whether this pastoral lenience was widespread or confined to particular regions and orders. The lore of good confessors suggests that mercy has a way of traveling faster than edicts. Market days pipe up like cheerful interruptions. A village swells with voices, and your feet remember yesterday's dancing. You see how calendars don't just constrain, they also provide occasions. A successful harvest earns a little spree of generosity. Ribbons, soap, a pastry with more spice than necessity can justify, and generosity in public often means generosity in private later. Sex learns to hitch a ride on gratitude's cart. There are, of course, hard weeks. Sickness, debt, a bad shearing, a cow that decides theology requires bells at 3 a.m. abstinence is sometimes chosen for sorrow rather than for saints. You watch a couple step through such a week with quiet hands, sleeping closer for comfort, speaking gently to a void, setting off the fine china of each other's nerves. The calendar allows this too. Time as medicine. Your third light joke knocks once, politely. The best contraceptive on haying week is haying week. A curious tidbit with a scholarly twinkle. Some calendars include little weather notes. Rain at St. Swithin's, rain for weeks. That people recite half playfully, half seriously. These predictions nudge plans for sewing, roofing, and yes, for nighttime warmth strategies. Are they accurate? Sometimes gloriously so. Sometimes they are confident fables that keep hands busy while clouds make up their minds. Historians still argue whether the persistence of such lore indicates resistance to clerical oversight, or simply the human desire to negotiate with the sky. You stop at a church porch again, the same porch where betrothals are spoken and market news gets laundered into respectability, and you notice a small board with saint names chalked in. Someone has drawn a little fish for Friday with a flourish that suggests at least one person can make fasting feel festive. That is the secret engine of these calendars, making constraint feel like choreography. Anyone can trip over a line. It takes craft to turn boundaries into steps that carry you around the room without bruised shins. Mainstream fact, Parish beat. The close times, for marriage periods when weddings are discouraged or forbidden, such as Lent and Advent, shape when couples schedule vows. This pressure radiates backward into courtship and forward into first nights, creating little whirlpools of celebration after the quiet season's end. You can feel the dam release when Easter passes and weddings suddenly populate the lane like jubilant geese in ribbons. The bedroom pays attention, because passion does love a parade even if it participates by whispering. Historians still argue whether these rules disproportionately affected poorer households, those whose work, rhythms already dictated abstinence of the too tired, kind more than the too pious kind. The evidence is sympathetic. People are practical, and they will keep the feast and the farm if they can, bending strictures toward peace rather than breaking them into scandal. At home, the table is set for a fast day meal that feels like a clever riddle solved. You taste onions softened into sweetness, barley that provides its own comfort, and a drizzle of oil that pretends not to be a treat but clearly is. Conversation touches lightly on tonight's plan. Rest, because dawn insists. Prayer, because gratitude wants an outlet. Closeness, perhaps, scheduled for a day when both mind and body say yes in the same sentence. The consent we admired at the church door still applies in the quiet share of blankets. The calendar is a guest at the table, not a jailer in the hall. Curious tidbit, festive edition. Some households keep feast night boxes with small saved luxuries, scented oil, a nice ribbon, a bit of better soap, brought out only on green light evenings, the way you might save a favorite playlist for a long drive. These are tiny theater props that signal, without words, that routine has made room for sparkle. Is this historically universal? No. It is humanly logical, which often rhymes with historically likely in pockets and pieces. You make one final circuit of the village as dusk rubs its eyes. The bells return to breathing. The lanes smell of fish, bread, wet wool, and the thin cinnamon someone smuggled into a recipe that claims not to notice it. Lovers exchange glances calibrated to the day. Newlyweds you remember from our section on Bed's Walk, with that newly combined gait, 2 strides learning to be one. Your mind, obedient to pattern, brings back a callback. The morning gift on the chest, the glove in a sleeve, the bread on a pillow. All of it is calendared tenderness, rituals that accept the schedule and then decorate it with warmth. The mini thesis folds into a final sentence for the night. Medieval intimacy grows calm and strong by listening to time, church time, work time, weather time, and then finding its own tempo inside those larger beats. When abstinence is required, tenderness holds the place. When feasts arrive, joy steps forward without apology. Sex does not become less itself when it keeps a calendar. It becomes more companionable, more woven into the house's patience. As you bank the fire, you trace tomorrow's date with a fingertip on the table's grain for no one but yourself. The dog sighs like a benediction. A shutter taps and settles. You carry this discipline of pace into the next room of the story, where monks, manuals, and sermons will try to annotate desire in the margins of conscience, and where you will listen closely to see whether instruction can speak in a voice soft enough to be invited through the curtain. Remember, the calendar was a negotiation that worked because it loved the people it guided. Manuals will need the same kindness if they're going to last till morning. You enter a room that smells faintly of vellum, ash, and patience. The windows are narrow, the light is honest, and a quill holds its breath above a page that has opinions. Monks, manuals, and modesty. This is the part of the house where words try to shepherd the world, and the world, to its credit, usually cooperates with good shepherds and politely ignores the fussy ones. You sit on a smooth bench warmed by generations of study, and you can hear the steady rasp of sand smoothing ink, the small creak of a wooden lectern that has heard confessions without ever moving from its spot. Tonight, desire is examined by daylight, labeled in tidy lines, and invited to walk in step with conscience. Sex doesn't disappear here. It's given rules, schedules, and footnotes, as if someone believes a human heart can be cataloged like a library. Mainstream historical fact clears its throat with monastic dignity. From late antiquity through the medieval centuries, penitentials and pastoral manuals, compiled by clerics, monks, and later scholastic theologians, guide confessors in advising laypeople on moral life, including marriage, sex, and abstinence. These texts list sins, outline penances, and increasingly emphasize intention and moderation, encouraging mutual consent in marital intimacy and concern for a spouse's well-being. The ideals are clear. Chastity for the professed religious, within marriage, faithfulness, self-control, and an ear tuned to the calendar. The practice, like any good chant, varies by region and choirmaster. Your mini-thesis rests easily on the desk. Medieval moral guidance does not so much aim to extinguish desire as to domesticate it, fitting sex within marriage into a rhythm of mutual care, prayer, and restraint, while reserving celibacy as a vocation for clergy and religious. The result is less a muzzle than a metronome. Remember the softness of Section 4's calendars. The manuals are their annotated companion. Where the calendar hummed, the manual speaks. Observe abstinence on these days, it says. Consider your spouse's health, it adds. Seek consent, it insists, though the way it phrases consent can sound more like pastoral caution than modern contract. Historians still argue whether these texts consistently centered mutual pleasure or primarily framed sex as procreative duty with toleration for comfort. Manuscripts sing different verses, and preachers add their own key changes. You follow a monk's finger as it traces a line. Confessor instructions advise asking about the circumstances, not just the acts. Were you drunk? Were you angry? Were you unkind? Which shifts the focus from mere rule-breaking to the quality of the relationship. It's hard to hate that. Sitting here, you realize the manual's best pages are less about don't and more about please do, in a voice that sounds like someone who has watched people for a long time and would prefer their sleep to be peaceful. A curious tidbit sidles in wearing an ink-stained sleeve. Some penitentials include unexpectedly practical household advice, alongside moral guidance, recommendations about sleep, diet, and timing, because a well-rested couple sins less ambitiously. One scribe doodles a fish in the margin near a fast day rule, which is the medieval equivalent of adding a grocery reminder to a self-help book. Is the fish judging you? Only if you burn it. The scriptorium air is cool, but the debates are warm. A friar clears his throat to question a colleague's example. Must every fast day apply to every household? What of illness, postpartum recovery, or times of grief? Another friar answers with a proverb about mercy knowing the way home. This is the unadvertised blessing of the manuals. They arm confessors to adapt, gently, not sloppily, so that a rule remains a help and not an anvil. Historians still argue whether lenience was the norm or the exception. Reading closely, you hear lenience clearing its throat in the margins, asking to be heard. Your first light joke leans against the inkhorn. If medieval confessionals had hold music, it would be a psalm refrain followed by, "Your virtue is important to us. Please remain patient while we connect you to a compassionate human being." And most of the time, they did. You think of Section 1's hearth and Section 3's bed, bread on the pillow, a coin as morning gift, a curtain that learned discretion, and notice how the manuals try to keep those rituals humane rather than brittle. Speak kindly, they imply. Don't wake each other like a storm. Remember the fast because it makes the feast sweeter. Sex isn't treated as an embarrassing accident in these better pages. It's a tool of companionship that needs maintenance and the occasional reminder not to be used while the paint is drying. Mainstream fact returns via Scholastic Avenue. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas will systematize moral thought in the high medieval period, distinguishing ends and intentions, placing marital sex within the order of go. Odds, procreation, fidelity, sacrament, and conceding that affection and relief are secondary but real goods. The tone is calm, almost administrative, like someone labeling drawers in a large chest that a whole town shares. The labeling doesn't replace experience, but it keeps the socks and spoons from fighting. Another curious tidbit turns a page. There are confession guides that include lists of questions tailored separately for husbands and wives, which reveals a social expectation of roles, but also an attempt to speak to each partner's conscience directly. Sometimes the advice is tenderly specific. Be patient if your spouse is ill. Be moderate if your spouse is weary. Do not withhold kindness as a weapon. The counsel reads like a person watching the evening from a window and choosing the gentlest word that still tells the truth. You catch, out of the corner of your eye, a monk's marginal note about dreams, what to do with the night's unruly narratives. The manual advises prayer, temperance, and not making a federal case out of a passing cloud. Your second light joke arrives with a wink. Medieval sleep hygiene is 1 part theology, 1 part chamomile, and 1 part not eating 6 honey cakes after Compline. The language of modesty threads through everything here, draped more like a curtain than a blindfold. Modesty is not intended to erase desire. It is meant to keep it from tripping over the furniture. Advice on dress, speech, and gesture tries to prevent scandal, not because eyes are sinful, but because gossip is an accelerant. If you remember Section 2's glove grammar, you already speak this language. The manuals try to give your sentences punctuation. Historians still argue whether clerical celibacy and monastic suspicion of the body cast a shadow that made lay sexuality feel suspect by contagion. The record is uneven. Sermons can sound severe. Pastoral letters can sound like a grandmother who just wants everyone to eat and be careful. Your ear learns to tell the difference. Severity often loves its own echo. Care adjusts its volume so the listener leans in, not away. In another chapter, you find admonitions against coercion, phrased in the vocabulary of the time, but clear enough to recognize, and reminders that marital rights include mutuality. Consent here is not a modern contract with signatures, but it is something sturdier than mere assumption. A conjugal debt owed reciprocally, framed as duty but pointing toward kindness. It's an imperfect scaffold that some couples used to build real tenderness. We can wish for better language, without denying the good that crept in wearing the clothes available. You step out of the scriptorium into the cloister, where the square of sky looks like a clean page and the fountain writes soft letters all day. Monks pass in pairs, voices low, and you can tell they are talking logistics more than ecstasy. Ale for guests, beds for pilgrims, repairs for the leaky chapter house roof. Even here, the ordinary is the canvas. The manuals were not written to float above life. They were written to keep life from fraying under the daily tug of hunger, temper, and tiredness. Curious Tidbit sits on a bench in the sun. Some monasteries brewed mild beers and herbal infusions offered to travelers, and the poor, practical comforts that also appear in lay households as gentle sleep aids. When a manual suggests rest and moderation, it is not speaking into a vacuum. The culture has tools, mint, valerian, warm milk, that pair ethics with physiology. Ethics often forgets to check on the body. The better pages remember, and the better households do too. Your third light joke shuffles in sandals. If a monk compliments your moderation, check whether you've simply fallen asleep during a sermon. It still counts. Back in the library, you spot a rubric in red ink about scandal and secrecy. The warning is both legal and pastoral. Don't turn private kindness into public spectacle. Don't turn public rules into pry bars for private spaces. Manuals at their best defend the curtain, not to deny affection, but to shield it. You think of Section 3's aunt, who knew exactly when to escort rowdy friends to the door. The manual is the aunt in book form, stern when necessary, sensible always. Mainstream fact, pastoral coda. Later medieval pastoral movements, friars preaching in towns, handbooks for parish priests, aim to carry consistent teaching to ordinary people, standardizing confession and instruction. This increases the reach of norms, but also spreads the practical wisdom of experienced confessors. The net effect is a common language for conscience. Whether that language always honored the complexities of each home is debatable, and historians still argue whether standardization warmed or cooled the pastoral climate. If you've ever filled out a form that replaced a conversation, you know the risk. If you've ever met a wise counselor who used a form as a door, not a wall, you know the potential. You tuck a quill behind your ear and notice your own posture has grown calmer reading these shelves. Perhaps it is the steady pace of lines that believe in better habits. Perhaps it is the way even the stricter pages leave room for exceptions like skylights, illness, childbirth, old age, penance that heals rather than humiliates. The best counsel in any age is recognizable by this trait. It arrives like a friend who washes the dishes without being asked. Remember our earlier herb sprigs, feast boxes, and morning gifts. Manuals don't invent those, they learn to tolerate them, sometimes even recommend them obliquely. Be cheerful, one marginal gloss implies. Keep the season. Consider your spouse's consolation. That's the heartbeat you carry back into the lane, a religion that, at its best moments, understands romance is part of survival, and survival is part of holiness. As the afternoon leans toward vespers, the choir gathers, and the first note rises like warm bread. You stand a moment longer between shelves, then close a book with the kind of care usually reserved for sleeping babies and newly mended nets. The mini-thesis returns for a last bow. Manuals don't erase desire. They try to choreograph it into a dance that won't step on neighbors' toes. Sometimes they stomp, often they guide. And when they are humane, they help a bed become a school of patience rather than a courtroom of rules. You walk out under the cloister arch, past a doorway where a brother has set a bowl of apples for anyone who passes. You take one sweet with a monk's sense of humor. It crunches like a well-timed penance. The village is just beyond the wall, waiting with its own pages. Laundry lists, market tallies, lullabies. You're ready to return to kitchens, where herbs and humors will try their hand at comfort, to see how households translate monastic counsel into warm cups, patient timing, and sleep that remembers it has a job to do. You return to a kitchen with a scholar's memory and a grandmother's patience. The shutters are open just enough to let the afternoon think it's welcome, and the table is set with the usual cast of characters. A mortar and pestle that has strong opinions about everything, a knife that prefers onions to drama, and a jug that smells faintly of last year's apples pretending they were born to be vinegar. Herbs, humors, and household cures. This is where love hires chemistry as a helpful assistant, where sex consults a spice rack, and where sleep pulls up a chair and insists on being part of the plan. A mainstream historical fact sets itself on the table like a loaf. Medieval medicine leans on humoral theory, balancing four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and their qualities: hot, cold, wet, dry, to guide diet, sleep, exercise, and remedies. Physicians, learned in Galenic and Arabic texts, recommend foods and routines to adjust a person's temperament. Household knowledge, often carried by women, midwives, and experienced elders, applies those ideas with herbs, baths, poultices, and a practical eye for what actually helps. Desire and mood are not excluded from this system. They're given seats next to appetite and sleep. Your mini-thesis for this section comes out warm and calm. Medieval households treat intimacy as partly medical and fully human, tuning the body with herbs, scents, and schedules so love and sex can show up as comfort rather than chaos, and letting sleep be the silent partner that makes everything else kinder. The recipe is not mysticism, it is maintenance. You lift the lid on a small box of dried plants, and the room exhales a gentle apothecary sigh. There's rosemary for remembrance, mint for headaches and digestion, sage for sore throats and sober minds, lavender for soothing, and a pinch of costly spice, cinnamon or clove, hoarded for feast days and courtship-level curry. Remember Section 4's Feast Night Box. This is the ancestor, little stores of fragrance and flavor that tilt the evening towards special. Curious tidbit joyful as a sprig on a windowsill. Some homes hang bundles of herbs, not just for drying, but for signaling. Mint above the door for visitors, chamomile near the bed for rest, and a modest knot of marjoram or yarrow when a household hopes for fertility. Whether such signals are widely read or mostly private theater varies by lane and decade. But the habit itself is a language, and languages are comforting even when only two people speak them. You lean over a pot where onions soften with a patient saints would envy. A physician, had you one, might advise warming foods, poultry, broth with herbs, bread with a bit of oil, to lift spirits and ease the body toward affectionate moods without tipping it into restlessness. Cold, damp weather. A wine posset with spice. Too much heat in the mind. Cool fruits, quiet room, less chatter, more listening. Historians still argue whether humoral prescriptions were followed faithfully or adapted freely. Kitchens suggest that adapta. Tian was the house's favorite sport. Your first light joke slides into the ladle. The medieval version of set the mood is probably open the window, shut the goose, and don't burn the onions. The mortified goose withdraws its complaint. Smell is the kitchen's poet. Civet and musk are too rich for most budgets, but rosewater, orange water, and herb infusions find their way into basins and linen. A drop on a wrist, a dampened cloth on the brow, a sheet rinsed in lavender water on summer nights. None of it is merely indulgence. For bodies that work as hard as these, comfort is not a treat. It is maintenance that keeps kindness possible. Sex, arriving at the end of such a day, benefits from the simple fact that someone took 10 extra minutes to make the air feel forgiving. Mainstream fact, botanical lane. Herbals compiled and copied through the Middle Ages, drawing on classical and Islamic sources, catalog uses of plants for ailments of body and mood, and midwifery traditions preserve practical knowledge about pregnancy, birth, and postpartum care. While physicians handle the grand diagnoses, households carry the daily medicine. Warming poultices, herb teas, restorative broths, and sleep rituals that begin with a hand on a shoulder and end with fewer noises in the room. If you can't afford a doctor, and most cannot, you can still afford patience. Remember our earlier thread about calendars and abstinence. The kitchen knows those rules and offers alternatives. On abstinent nights, a couple might share a longer talk over warm milk and honey, then sleep closer for comfort without moving the line. On feast nights, the same milk gets cinnamon if fortune allows, and the bed gets a blanket warmed by the hearth. The continuity matters. Intimacy has more than one speed, and practice at the gentle speeds improves the rest. A curious tidbit wearing an apron. Some households keep sleep stones, smooth rocks warmed by the fire and wrapped in cloth, to tuck at the foot of a bed on cold nights. It's a practical thing that feels like a love letter addressed to toes. And because we promised 3 light jokes per 1,000 words, here's the second. If your partner steals the sleep stone, it's an invitation to negotiate or to deploy a second stone labeled cooperation. You slice bread and realize how much of desire's success depends on blood sugar, hydration, and the absence of splinters. Humoral talk at its best is simply a respectful way to say, be fed, be warm or cool as needed, be clean if you can, be rested, and be polite to the person whose day looked a lot like yours. Sex appreciates dignity. Hunger and grime are rarely its allies unless everyone thinks that's part of the plot, which for most it is. Mainstream fact, sleep desk. Medieval households often sleep polyphasically, naps when work allows. First sleep and second sleep through the night for some, especially in winter when nights are long. This creates a natural intermission in the dark hours, a quiet time for prayer, for stoking the fire, for whispered conversation. And yes, sometimes for sex, when the house has calmed and the body, rewarmed, remembers it is human and hopeful. Historians still argue whether two sleeps were universal or regional. References occur often enough to suggest the pattern was real for many, flexible for others, mythical for some who simply slept like logs. You pour warm water into a basin scented with rosemary and lemon balm and invite hands, faces, and feet to remember they aren't tools. That feeling, the sigh that a clean face produces, is foreplay's humble cousin. It puts bodies on each other's side. If Section 3's bed was a negotiation table, Section 6's basin is the treaty ratification, signed with steam. Another curious tidbit, kitchen witch edition. A salt pinch thrown into the fire before bed for peace is a thing in some places. A fizz, a sparkle, a tiny theater that announces the house has decided not to quarrel tonight. Is it efficacious? As much as a promise, which is to say, often enough to matter. Historians still argue whether to categorize such gestures as superstition, folk Christianity, or just good manners with pyrotechnics. Because we said we'd use the words plainly when needed. Sexual desire in this house is allowed to be present without being bossy. If one partner is tired or unwell, the other treats abstaining as affection, not starvation. On better nights, attention to the body warmth, smell, ease, makes sex feel like comfort rather than conquest. Confessors, manuals, remember Section 5, actually help here when they suggest mutuality and gentleness, even if they speak in a vocabulary tuned to their time. Your third light joke pops like a clove in hot wine. The quickest way to kill the mood is stepping on a stray spindle whorl in the dark, a medieval Lego with theological consequences. You glance at the shelf with remedies labeled in chalk. There's a jar of honey that turns everything it meets into a better version of itself. There's a crock of vinegar sharp enough to tidy a sulk. There are seeds in muslin bags, fennel, anise, caraway, that soothe bellies and minds. The economy here is elegant. Simple things doing double duty, the way a compliment about bread can also be a compliment about hands. Mainstream fact learned lane. Translations of medical works from Arabic into Latin, Averroes, Avicenna, and others, bring more sophisticated pharmacology and diagnosis into European learning, filtering slowly into practice through university-trained physicians. But even where that learning arrives, households continue to fix most things themselves, using the books when they can, their mothers' voices when they can't. Historians still argue whether elite medicine looked down on domestic remedies. Some texts sneer, others collaborate, and the patient, sensibly, goes with whoever has the better track record on Tuesday. The stove mutters a lullaby. You think about perfumes again, not heavy court scents, but household fragrances. Beeswax on wood, bread steam, clean wool, crushed mint, smoke from a good fire. These are not aphrodisiacs as potion mongers imagine them. They are a choir of small comforts that tell the nervous system, you are allowed to like the person beside you. It is hard to be sensual in a room that smells like fear. It is easy to be kind in a room that smells like patience. A curious tidbit, quietly labeled as such. Some midwives swear by sleep drafts for new parents, warm milk, with poppy or lettuce seed to coax rest when adrenaline hums and the babies schedule treats time like a suggestion. Poppy is a tricky friend, dosed carefully if at all, and households vary in their bravery. But the impulse is consistent. Let sleep do half the work of healing before you try to think your way back to normal. You retrieve a folded cloth from the chest, a better linen saved for shared nights, and remember the curtain, the key, the morning gift. Continuity is the love language of this house. When a couple treats special nights as a series rather than a one-off, they teach their bodies to expect gentleness, which is half of tenderness power. The other half is the willingness to crack a joke when the candle misbehaves. That willingness has never gone out of style. Historians still argue whether herbs commonly touted as aphrodisiacs, rocket, saffron, fennel, even eggs and almonds, had any effect beyond placebo. Kitchens shrug. Placebo is still in effect, especially when both partners happily conspire to believe in it. What you can measure with scales is not always what matters to hearts that have hauled water all day. The room dims. The shutters draw a little closer together. You place the warmed stone at the foot of the bed, set the second cup by the table, hydration and hint, a matched set, and smooth the linen with a hand that says, "I cared enough to do this before you got here." Sex will decide for itself how far it wants to walk tonight. Sleep has already agreed to join, whenever invited. When calendars say abstain, this same room will look almost the same. Only the candle left unlit. The second cup swapped for a longer conversation, while the poppy-free milk cools just enough. Before you blow out the candle, you say our debate lines softly into the air, because kitchen's like a good argument, phrased kindly. Historians still argue whether medieval domestic medicine fundamentally empowered households, or simply papered over structural lack of access to professional care. Both can be true, and meanwhile the soup still needs salt. The mini-thesis hums once more as you bank the coals. Intimacy here is practical alchemy, heat, herb, habit, turning fatigue into friendship and desire into a version of rest that smiles. Remember the herb knots by the bed, the salt fizz in the fire, the sleep stone tucked like a secret, the second cup waiting its turn. Tomorrow's streets will be louder, licensed brothels, guild rules, and those gray zones where economics and morality shake hands and count fingers. Take this kitchen's patience with you. It's the best pocket charm for complicated neighborhoods. You step into streets that pretend to be asleep and never quite manage it. Lanterns sway like thoughtful punctuation, water whispers under stone bridges, laughter travels in pockets, never quite spilling. Brothels, guilds, and gray zones. This is the neighborhood where reputations wear uniforms by day and compromises by night, where economics and morality exchange receipts, and where sex moves from the private grammar of the home into a public script, carefully edited by law, custom, and the practical need to keep the peace. You keep your voice low. The stones prefer witnesses who whisper. A mainstream historical fact stands under a lantern and raises its hand. In many medieval towns, prostitution is tolerated or formally regulated at various points. Licensed quarters, designated houses, or stews, overseen by civic or ecclesiastical authorities, with rules about location, clothing, fees, and health measures that change by city and century. The official logic is utilitarian. Channel vice to prevent worse disorder, protect respectable households from temptation and scandal, and collect taxes that fund civic projects. The unofficial logic is messier. Demand persists. Regulation follows like a cart behind a stubborn horse. Your mini-thesis tonight keeps a steady footing. Medieval cities try to manage sexuality as infrastructure, zoning it, taxing it, branding it, so that public order appears intact, even as private realities shrug. The result is a gray zone where law, livelihood, and loneliness negotiate terms that are never final. Remember Section 6's kitchen, where comfort was a science of herbs. Here, comfort is commerce with a price list. A matron keeps a ledger as neat as a guild scribe S. A door stands open and not open, offering warmth without names. Gentle laughter from an upstairs window suggests that the joke is skillfully told, and the punchline arrives right on schedule, including a washed basin and a clean sheet, because hygiene is both advertisement and mercy. Historians still argue whether regulation improved safety for sex workers or merely concentrated risk. Records offer contradictions: ordinances that require health checks and separate clothing, fines levied for disorder, petitions by brothel keepers to maintain order, sermons thundering against the trade, occasional expulsions of districts that shift the problem rather than solve it. The noise resolves into one clear chord. Cities care about reputation more than righteousness, and economics more than empathy, though individuals often manage to be kinder than their bylaws. A curious tidbit stands in a doorway with a shrewd smile. Some towns require sex workers to wear specific garments, striped hoods, yellow veils, or belts, so they are visibly marked, while forbidding them from certain colors or jewels reserved for guild wives and daughters. The effect is branding dressed as modesty. Does it prevent confusion? Sometimes. Does it soothe moralists? Often. Does it protect the women? Not nearly enough. You pass a bathhouse, humming like a beehive. Beneath the steam, deals are made more often than diseases, though both make appearances. The phrase stew will earn a double life: hot water and hot rumor. A proprietor posts rules in a hand you recognize as a clerk moonlighting for coin. No weapons, no shouting. Pay first. If the bath is virtue's cousin, it is the cousin everyone invites to dinner because it brings towels and leaves early. Mainstream fact, civic edition. Guilds regulate crafts with zeal, apprenticeships, quality, prices, and the city applies similar logic to sexual commerce. Licensing, fees, curfews, designated streets. The goal is predictability. Respectable quarters are spared. The riverfront absorbs the noise. In some places, brothels are even municipal property, leased like mills. It is prudence wearing an apron and pretending not to be scandalized. Your first light joke hangs a sign: closed on feast days, open on days when sailors get paid. A schedule that would make the calendar in Section 4 roll its eyes, and then quietly pencil it in. You notice faces. Working women laugh together like people who trust only the company they keep. A madam with steel in her spine instructs a new arrival about boundaries and fees. A clever friend stands guard with a bored expression that could curdle milk. The house runs on rules of its own: consent as contract, courtesy as commodity, refusal as a right that is theoretically protected, practically negotiated. Historians still argue whether municipal protection was meaningful or performative. Court records show both enforcement and indifference, with the tilt depending on who complained and who listened. A curious tidbit, coin bright and unromantic. Some ordinances set maximum prices for services, as if desire were bred and could be indexed to grain costs. The intention is to prevent extortion, the outcome to prevent private bargaining. Markets, as usual, smile and continue existing in the S. Haddow of paper. People who legislate bodies often underestimate the elasticity of need and the ingenuity of survival. Remember the charivari from Section 3, the noisy parade that polices domestic oddities. Here, noise is a different instrument, used by neighbors to keep the district's manners tidy. A brawl earns a shouted chorus, and sometimes a bucket. Peace is prized because peace equals income. In this way, economics performs a version of pastoral care that sermons rarely manage. Enforce quiet or lose customers. Mainstream fact, health lane. Some cities appoint women inspectors or require physicians to examine workers for visible signs of disease, though medieval medical understanding is limited. Measures include temporary closures, fines, and in theory, care. In practice, blame travels faster than balm. You think of Section 6's basil and vinegar and realize how much safer a kitchen is than a port. Safety is a privilege the city rarely pays for. Your second light joke arrives on soft shoes. A guild baker complains that his loaves sell worse when the district is loud at night, which makes him a reluctant lobbyist for decency, though his real passion is sleep. You pass a small chapel tucked against a lane, candle-stubbed and unembarrassed. Someone kneels, someone weeps, someone pays for a mass with coins that smell faintly of perfume. The coexistence is not hypocrisy. It is the medieval habit of acknowledging that souls require maintenance even when lives require compromises. Historians still argue whether late medieval piety softened civic attitudes toward sex work or intensified condemnation. The ledger of indulgences is complex, and so are the motives pinned to donations. A curious tidbit, penitent but practical. Certain saints acquire reputations as patrons of the fallen, Mary Magdalene chief among them, turning chapels into places where a woman can pray without being stared into stone. Devotion offers a tiny amnesty. For half an hour, everyone is just a person kneeling. Civic pride inserts itself. A magistrate sings the town's cleanliness in a proclamation, praising orderly markets and quiet nights. He does not mention the street behind him where a door opens and a figure steps in with coins counted to the last copper. Cities are like that. They point where they want visitors to look. You have learned, across 6 sections, to listen to what the city doesn't say. It tells you where the tender spots are. Mainstream fact, moral economy. Preachers, particularly mendicants, address sexual commerce in their rounds, warning men against exploitation and women against scandal, lamenting poverty's role, urging charity, sometimes arranging exit dowries or placements for those who want to leave. Not all sermons burn. Some attempt to build ladders. The record of practical help is imperfect, but it exists, often in the margins where mercy does its best work. Remember the morning gift in Section 3, the gentle coin that said, "I will care for you after." Here, coins say, "I will leave before dawn," and the phrase is neither cruel nor kind. It is a fact. Yet kindness shows up in small angles, a clean towel folded, a bowl of hot water offered without a sigh, a warning passed through the house about a man who doesn't listen. In places with rules worth the ink, such a man meets a door that doesn't open again. Your third light joke perches on a sill. The neighborhood's unofficial anthem is "Keep It Down," with a descant of pay in exact change. Historians still argue whether these districts truly protected respectable women by absorbing male desire, or whether they simply institutionalized exploitation under the banner of order. The contradiction survives because both can be true. Protection for some built on risk for others. A city pretending not to know that is not naive. It is complicit. And yet, to walk these streets with your eyes open is to see more than vice. It is to see labor, emotional, bodily, logistical, performed by people who know their world's limits and still carve out rules, friendships, and moments of humor sharp enough to slice a bad night in half. The brothel's matron wields a glance that most aldermen would rent if they could. The young woman with a braid like a rope catalogs danger faster than any guardsman. The cleaner hums psalms that traveled from cloister to kitchen to this room without asking permission. Remember the glove signals, the herb knots, the bed's curtain, the calendar's ribbons. The same culture that codifies love in tapestries codifies sex in tax rolls. Both are languages. One pretends to be poetry, the other pretends to be prose. Both depend on readers who notice subtext. You notice because the last 6 rooms trained your eye. As you leave the lantern-lit quarter, a constable nods from his corner like a punctuation mark that closes, but does not end the sentence. The river breathes out fog, the market square counts its benches, an upstairs window releases a short log. H you choose to interpret as friendship rather than transaction, because people insist on being people even when the city pretends they are line items. The mini thesis folds into your pocket one more time. Regulation makes a map. Lives travel off-road. The gray zone is not a failure of law. It is a report on human need and civic compromise. Sex here is a livelihood negotiated under pressure, a public secret everyone rehearses and nobody fully admits. Tomorrow, you'll walk into a different argument, poetry and parish courts, and weigh fantasy against fines, lyrics against ledgers, discovering that the city's sweetest songs often have a footnote in small print. For now, the lanterns swing like tired metronomes. You pass a baker setting dough for dawn, and a watchman rehearsing his rounds in a voice that would be more convincing if he were not so obviously humming. Somewhere behind you, a curtain closes. Somewhere ahead, a quill sharpens its nib to record tomorrow's cases. You keep to the middle of the lane where even compromises feel balanced. And you carry a quiet wish forward from the kitchen. May tenderness learn to unionize more successfully than foxes. You slip into a room where words hang like tapestries and laws rustle like straw. A lute rests in a chair, as if it is pretending to be tired. A stack of parchment on the table looks unamused. Love lyrics and legal whispers. This is where fantasy puts on perfume and reality clears its throat. Where troubadours paint love with impossible colors and parish courts quietly ask for receipts. You sit between them, close enough to hear both, and the contrast is the whole entertainment. One voice rhymes, the other itemizes. A mainstream historical fact arrives with a practiced bow. From the 12th century onward, courts across southern France and beyond nurture the culture of troubadours and trouvers, poets who celebrate finamour or refined love, structured by elaborate codes of devotion, secrecy, and restraint, often directed toward a high-born lady, not the poet's wife. At the same time, in towns and villages, ecclesiastical and manorial courts record disputes over betrothals, promises, gifts, dowries, gossip, and sexual slander, adjudicating who said what to whom and what it means for reputations and contracts. Poetry raises the mood. The courts keep the receipts. Your mini thesis for this section plays 2 strings at once. Medieval culture runs on a double system, songs that rehearse idealized longing, and local courts that translate longing into law or fine when it wanders off the approved path. So that desire has both a dream to chase and a fence to respect. Remember Section 2's gloves and glances, the careful choreography that made flirtation deniable. The songs make that deniability into art. A lover praises the lady's eyes, which are the color of any court that pays well. He swears fidelity to a person whose name he never says, a trick that allows 3 ladies in the hall to be flattered at once without starting a duel. In the refrain, he suffers nobly, and everybody enjoys the performance because noble suffering is safest when it fits in a stanza. Meanwhile, outside the hall, a parish court hears a case of promised marriage, where a couple allegedly exchanged vows in private, words in present tense, hands joined, witnesses not quite official, and now both families want clarity. Historians still argue whether clandestine marriages were common or merely common enough to make record keepers sweat. What's clear is that the law recognizes consent as the core, but the community insists on proof. Romantic vows are real. They are also really expensive to untangle. A curious tidbit peeks through the vellum. Some courts admit love tokens as evidence, ribbons, rings, combs, if accompanied by testimony about the words spoken when they were given. A ribbon without a sentence is just a ribbon. A ribbon with "I take you" attached becomes a thread the court will not stop pulling until it reaches a conclusion or a compromise. The troubadour's ribbon can stay a symbol. The parish's ribbon becomes a footnote. You watch a poet tune his lute, practicing a canso in which the speaker, loyal as a well-trained hound, refuses every earthly reward except a single glance. The audience sighs out of habit and pleasure. Historians still argue whether courtly love taught manners or theatrics. Perhaps manners are theatrics performed long enough to become sincere. In any case, the poem ends with a flower metaphor, and the room nods, content to be a garden for one more song. Then the legal whispering resumes, this time a defamation suit. Someone called someone light in the lane, and the word weighs more than flour. Slander about sex is a currency in small communities, and parish courts fine it not because they are prudish, but because reputation is infrastructure. If a woman's good name is a bridge, gossip is rot, and the court is a carpenter. Mainstream fact, local justice, ecclesiastica. Courts handle sexual slander with penances, small fines, and public apologies, tools that repair social fabric without tearing it further. Your first light joke pats the lute. In the poetry, the lover whispers grace. In the court record, the clerk writes case. And both are resolved by someone who knows more about meter than anyone admits. You cross to the table where parchment bristles with Latin abbreviations. A proctor points to a line about pre-contract, the legal promise before a wedding that can bind as tightly as a knot in wet rope. If a new suitor appears with a better dowry, the old words don't simply evaporate. They have to be confronted, dissolved by mutual release, or enforced by the judge. The troubadour writes of a lady's favor as a token in the game. The court treats a favor as evidence in a file. Remember Section 3's morning gift, Section 4's calendar, Section 5's manuals. They all show up as witnesses in these disputes. A morning gift gives weight to claims of consummation. A feast day marking an engagement helps date a promise. A confessor's counsel about consent reframes a quarrel into an agreement. The songbook and the statute book don't share a shelf, but they share a town. A curious tidbit clinks like a coin. In some places, a couple shares bride ale, a communal drink to raise funds or celebrate union. Disputes later reference who poured, who paid, who kissed whose cup. Even beer gets deposed. Historians still argue whether such customs reflect binding steps in marriage making or are merely festive noise. The court treats them as context, not contract, fog that hints at an unseen river. The poet, call him a professional sigh, moves to a new genre, the alba, a dawn song where lovers part reluctantly as a watchman warns of sunrise. It is the opposite of Section 3's escorted bedding. Here, secrecy is the thrill, risk is the perfume, and dawn is the chaperone. The audience blushes with enjoyment and plausible deniability. They are in love with love, and who can blame them? But in the parish book across town, the watchman appears as a witness, not a tenor. And his job is to declare what he saw, not what he felt about it. Mainstream fact, poetic geography. Occitan courts produce a sophisticated vocabulary for desire, mesura measure, joy joy, pretz worth. That treats restraint as part of passion's sheen. This is not hypocrisy. It is the medieval intuition that desire is sweeter when difficulty teaches it manners. That intuition filters outward into vernacular literature and inward into private expectations, shaping how people talk about longing even when their own lives look more like barley than brocade. Your second light joke clears its throat. If courtly love had terms of service, it would say, no touching, lots of sighing, renew annually. A clerk reads from a witness list. Neighbors testify about who visited whose house at what hour, whether a hand was held on a porch, whether a promise was overheard through an honest accident called a thin wall. The record cares about sequence. Gift, promise, visit, kiss, visit, bands like beads on a cord. What it will not admit is the poet's neat reversal, where virtue grows brighter the more impossible it becomes. Law prefers possible, provable, preferably before noon. A curious tidbit from the poetry corner. In a playful corner of this tradition, the courts of love, allegedly presided over by noble ladies, arbitrate lovers' disputes in mock legal fashion, pronouncing clever verdicts about jealousy, favors, and the duties of constancy. Whether these courts actually met or were literary conceits remains debated. Historians still argue whether any real sessions occurred beyond staged entertainments. But the trope shows how legal thinking seeped into romance like wine into bread. You step outside into the porch where village notices hang beside a tattered song sheet. Someone has inked a heart in the margin of a fine for grazing pigs on common land. The juxtapositions are everywhere. Love notes flutter next to regulations about ditches. A bride's ribbon is pinned under a notice about market tolls. A minstrel advertises lessons for polite serenade, while the sexton posts a reminder about fast day fish. The town doesn't segregate its dreams and rules. It tapes them to the same board. Mainstream fact, slander subset. Women bring defamation suits to defend their reputations with notable frequency in some records, asserting agency through law even when social power is constrained. The remedy may be a public apology at the church door, a place you remember from Section 2 and Section 3, turning the site of vows into a site of repair. The poetry calls the door a threshold for longing. The law uses it as a stage for reconciliation. Your third light joke tips its hat to the notary. Poets use pseudonyms to protect ladies. Notaries use abbreviations to protect parchment, and both think this is elegant. The lute resumes a gentle air, this time a past. Rela, where a knight meets a shepherdess and roles briefly flip, the lower status wit outmaneuvering the higher status swagger. The audience giggles because social inversion is safe when it's sung. Out in the court, social inversion is less comic. A poor man suing a rich neighbor needs witnesses with iron spines. Song teaches the taste for fairness. Law attempts the recipe with whatever ingredients it can afford. Remember the brothel quarter from Section 7, its ledgers and lanterns. The songs mostly ignore it, preferring to pretend desire only visits noble windows. The court cannot ignore it. The court sees payments, fights, and the quiet, persistent labor you noticed in those lanes. The dissonance is instructive. Lyric love is selective vision by design. Legal love is a map with all the inconvenient footpaths drawn in. A curious tidbit with ink on its fingers. Some scribes copy both saints, lives, and love lyrics, sometimes in the same manuscripts, or at least on the same desk. The hands that illuminate martyrdoms also dot refrains with tiny red marks. This is not contradiction, it is employment. Medieval minds are capacious. They can keep two tunes in key at once. As evening leans in, the court adjourns with a tidy list of penances and promises. A fine here, bans to be announced there, a gossip to apologize, a couple to marry or to stay apart until they can afford to keep a pig. The poet ends with a refrain about a glance that will sustain him for 3 winters, which the baker in the back row privately recommends against as a meal plan. You hear in both finales the same longing for order, an order where feelings are recognized and harm is repaired, where a song lifts the spirit and a statute steadies the feet. Historians still argue whether courtly love softened or sharpened expectations in real marriages. Did it raise the bar for tenderness, or did it build a fantasy that daily life resented? Sources suggest both. Couples borrow the nicest lines and leave the rest in the hall. Meanwhile, courts ensure that promises spoken in heat meet reality in daylight. You gather the scattered echoes, ribbons admitted as evidence, kisses counted as clues, vows shaped into sentences on parchment, songs staging emotions that law cannot adjudicate, but life insists on feeling. The mini-thesis folds back over the room in one quiet sentence. The Middle Ages gave desire 2 languages, lyric and legal, so it could say, I love and also, I promise, and then live with the consequences of both. You step away from the table and the chair with the lute, and find the night has already written its first line outside. Stars pinned up like notes on a staff. Tomorrow, widows and workers will claim the stage, property and grief, second chances and steady hands, and the town will show another talent of this era, its practicality in the face of loss, its tenderness in the face of economics. Bring the refrain with you. Sing sweetly, sign carefully, sleep well. You walk into a morning that smells like rye bread and rain, deciding whether to happen. The lane is steady, not loud, the kind of quiet that lets you hear shoes that know their roots. Widows, workers, and second chances. This is the part of town where love is practical and brave, where sex remembers its manners because survival shares the bed, and where tenderness re-enters the scene with a toolbox. You pass a doorway where a black ribbon is still pinned, faded now. Inside, voices measure their words the way hands measure flour, carefully, then with confidence. A mainstream historical fact steps forward with a ledger under its arm. In much of medieval Europe, a widow often holds dower rights, a life interest in a portion of her late husband's lands or income, giving her economic footing, however modest, and a degree of legal standing in local courts. She can petition, contract, and in many cases, choose whether or not to remarry, though family and community pressures apply like weather. Sometimes gentle, sometimes gusty. That legal floor is not always thick, but it is a floor, and feet on floors learn to dance again. Your mini-thesis for this section sets itself on the threshold with a level gaze. After loss, medieval households reconfigure with competence, property, kinship, and work braid into new patterns, so companionship and sex, if they return, do so as part of a larger project, keeping life going with dignity and a dry roof. Love here is an apprenticeship in patience. You step into a widow's kitchen that looks like it learned to breathe in a new rhythm without being asked. The chest's key hangs in a different place now. The bench has 1 cushion less. The work has been redistributed without ceremony. Grief is not theatrical here. It's woven into chores so thoroughly that it's hard to untangle without making a mess. You see a loaf sliced thinner to stretch the week, an extra pot of pottage traded with a neighbor whose ox threw a shoe, and a small cloak freshly mended, because a child will not stop growing out of things just because someone is missing. Remember Section 3's morning gift and Section 6's sleep stone. Continuity is kindness, and a house that remembers how to be kind remembers how to heal. On the mantle, a ribbon kept from a wedding day sits beside a newer ribbon from a saint's vigil, old promise, new patience, and tonight's fire will warm both without asking awkward questions. Sex is a distant visitor in this room, not because it is unwelcome, but because it is polite enough to wait until bread and sleep have had their turns. A curious tidbit sits quietly at the table. In some towns, widows enjoy guild-related privileges, running a deceased husband's shop until an heir can claim it, or permanently if she is skilled, turning competence into a public credential. It is not universal and not always easy, but it exists, and you can feel how a loom or a ledger under steady hands becomes a love letter to a life still worth living. Work hums, spindles twist, looms stamp a calm heartbeat, dye kettles mutter in a vocabulary of warm vowels. You meet a fuller who knows 50 ways cloth can sulk and 49 ways to coax it back, a brewer who calibrates barley and water with the mastery of a liturgist, and a mason whose palm can read the mood of stone. Desire in such company is shy, but it's not gone. It watches people be useful and remembers that admiration is a sturdy form of affection. Historians still argue whether women's work expanded or contracted under different urban statutes. The evidence suggests a patchwork, with vivid exceptions that insist on being remembered. Your first light joke leans in with a twinkle. The medieval pickup line most likely to succeed in this neighborhood is "Your thatch is watertight," followed closely by "I mended your rake teeth. Count them." You pause at the parish court door, where a slate lists cases for the day. A dispute over pasture rights, a complaint about slander, of course, words travel faster than carts, and a petition from a widow to confirm her dower share against an impatient nephew. The clerk's chalk is firm. Law here is not romantic, it's domestic infrastructure, a bridge no one praises until it cracks. When the bridge holds, people can think about more than not falling. Mainstream fact, Market Lane. Remarriage rates for widows and widowers vary by age, wealth, and dependence. For many, remarriage is a strategic kindness. Labor added to a household, care for children, protection against hunger and rumor. Romance can arrive by degrees, like warmth returning to a hand after a cold walk. And yes, sex follows the same route, reintroduced as something familiar that must be learned afresh with someone who laughs in a different place than the last person did. You meet that laugh in the market, two voices haggling with affection disguised as arithmetic. A baker in need of firewood negotiates with a widow who knows chords and costs better than he knows his WN oven. The banter is light, the glance is practical, and you can almost see a future in which an extra loaf goes one way and an extra bucket of ash goes the other. And then a bench is shared on a long evening, and then a ribbon is moved on the mantel again. Remember the courtship signals, gloves and glances. At this scale, the glove is a loaned knife returned sharper. The glance is a joke that lands without wobbling. A curious tidbit with a soft tread. In some communities, there's a tradition of widow benches near church walls or market squares, informal places where women sit to trade news, watch the world, and be seen on purpose. Visibility is power. The bench is both lookout and embassy. If someone wants to speak honestly about help, they know where to go. No formal registry, just common knowledge and a habit of dignity. Work brings you downriver to the docks, where ropes argue with knots and win, and up to the hill, where sheep graze in a rumination that looks like prayer. Workers from sunrise to lantern-light craft, a solidarity that is neither speech nor statute. A thatcher's apprentice hauls bundles. A widow's eldest carries laundry in a basket that is almost a house all by itself. In these rhythms, intimacy has to be both patient and opportunistic. A shared cup under an eave during sudden rain. A compliment traded across a fence that remembers the last winter. A hand offered over a ditch, then withdrawn before gossip has a chance to grow legs. Historians still argue whether community oversight protected widows from predatory suitors or hindered their autonomy. Sources tell stories on both sides: nosy aunts who save lives, nosy aunts who sabotage happiness. The rule of thumb seems to be: a good aunt is better than law, a bad aunt is worse than winter. Your second light joke puts its elbows on the table. Nothing accelerates a remarriage like 3 consecutive roof leaks and a cousin who says, "I could fix that if only I knew the household schedule," thereby proposing by hammer. Inside, the house studies its calendar again, less strictly than during feast and fast, but with as much care. Grief anniversaries block off days for quiet. Good harvests open doors for music. If affection returns, sex follows carefully, like a friend who knows which chairs creak. The bed has been a hospital for months. It will need time to accept the promotion back to a place where laughter is normal. The curtain remembers how to be a wall and a wing at once. Mainstream fact, property corner. Widows may hold land in their own names under dower. Some women also bring property from natal families that remains under their control, depending on custom. This creates a chessboard where proposals are moves made with eyes on both tenderness and tenure. People are not cynical because they care about land. They are faithful to the knowledge that children need bread before they need sonnets. When both arrive, everyone sleeps better. You pause with a midwife resting her back on a church step. She carries knowledge like a lantern: births, deaths, bodies that need time, bodies that need gentleness. Her hands have been in more family stories than any official seal. When she advises a widow about pacing a new marriage, it is in the language of seasons. Wait for spring in the body before you plant. You realize how often sex here is spoken of as gardening, not fireworks, tending, not spectacle. A curious tidbit in traveling shoes. Some regions hold ale feasts to raise support for widows, brewing a special batch, selling cups, turning community thirst into rent and respect. Names get written, debts get settled, and a kitchen gets a month of security. You can almost hear Section 8's Bride Ale smiling across the square at this cousin event. Ale is democracy in a mug. Remember Section 7's Gray Zones, the lantern districts where rules pretend to hold the line. A few women here have walked those streets and returned with eyes that see everything. They bring survival skills into daylight, an insistence on boundaries, a ledger that's always up to date, alliances with neighbors and clergy who know the true meaning of the word advocate. The city prefers to write such returns in tiny script. Households write them in bread. Your third light joke opens the cupboard. The sexiest words a widow hears this month are "I sharpened your shears," with honorable mention to "I stacked the kindling by size." Even in second chances, the law hums background music. Bans must be read again. Property must be protected for children from the first marriage. Dowries and dower must be reconciled. Prenuptial logic gets invented in practice, even if not in name. Sex, when it steps back into the room, does so like someone arriving at Compline late, welcome, and aware that the house has habits that are not to be jolted just for the fun of it. Historians still argue whether widows were courted for love, for land, or for labor. The answer is yes, in overlapping sir. Does that change color with each story? You meet examples of all three before lunchtime. One man sincerely loves a woman who knows where every hinge in the village squeaks and can hum 4 lullabies at once. Another calculates acreage like a prayer. The third wants a partner who will laugh at his jokes about barley. The woman in each case evaluates not just the man, but the fit, his temper with her children, his honesty with her accounts, his ability to hold silence on the nights that still need it. Work continues. A cloth dyer tips a vat and watches blue become sky on wool. You are reminded how color returns to life in stages, how joy is cautious before it is bold. A widow learning a new husband's laugh will learn his breath, his patience, his timing. Sex is not a cure for grief, but it can be a tutor in normalcy when normal has forgotten its lines. And on nights when it's better to sleep, sleep is an honorable guest who understands. A curious tidbit, kindly labeled as such. There are charms murmured at doorways for new unions after loss, the quenching of a coal and the lighting of a new one from the neighbor's hearth. A broom stood in a threshold to gather old sorrow and usher in sturdy luck. Folklore. Yes. Also therapy disguised as housekeeping. The house approves. It likes rituals that make sense to brooms. Remember the early sections, the plea for consent at the door, the calendar's patience, the manual's moderation. All of that returns here, matured. Consent after loss is slower because it must renegotiate with memory. Calendars are gentler because grief moves at its own liturgical pace. Manuals speak more softly, or they should. Good confessors know that the word again needs a blessing of its own. The lane grows blue with evening. A child runs past with a crust, triumphant. A man waves from atop a thatch like a bird, thinking practical thoughts. The widow you've been quietly watching all day lifts a bucket, pauses, and smiles at a neighbor in a way that contains both gratitude and hypothesis. You can almost hear Section 2's glove and Section 5's modesty nodding across the street. You can certainly hear Section 6's kettle recommending warm milk as punctuation for any conversation that dares to stretch past sundown. The mini thesis folds like linen on a chair back. After loss, love and sex return by doing the dishes, work first, then warmth, so that when laughter comes back, it lands on a table that can hold it. Second chances are not epics. They are well-edited diaries with generous margins. You take one more look at the ribbon on the mantel, at the bench that remembers two different weights from two different lives, and at the key that hangs where it can be found without ceremony. Tomorrow, you will walk with travelers and vows, journeys that test devotion, tokens that carry the scent of someone not present, promises that learn to live across miles. To arrive there, you'll carry this room's lesson in your pocket like a small, warm stone. Tenderness is maintenance that refuses to be bored, and the bravest romances are the ones that keep roofs from leaking. You step onto a road that has been walked down so many times it hums its own tune. The milestones are honest, the ditches opinionated, and the hedgerows politely curious about travelers. Journeys, vows, and tender endurance. This is the long-distance chapter of love, where promises learn to stretch without snapping, where sex waits with patience or rejoins with relief, and where tokens carry more weight than their materials can explain. A pilgrim bell rings once and then leaves the sound behind, like a good guest who doesn't prolong a goodbye. A mainstream historical fact walks beside you at an even pace. Pilgrimage in medieval Europe is both devotion and travel, routes to shrines like Santiago, Rome, and Jerusalem threaded with hostels, hospitals, and way stations, undertaken for penance, petition, thanksgiving, or vow fulfillment. Husbands and wives sometimes travel together. Often one goes, while the other holds the home together with twine, ledgers, and a stubbornly cheerful broom. The road is not just geography, it is a contract with time. Your mini-thesis for this section lays itself down like a pathstone. Medieval devotion teaches couples that love can operate at a distance, sustained by ritual, letters when possible, tokens always, and a shared schedule of prayer. So that when bodies separate, the household soul remains a single roof. It isn't easy, it is practiced. You remember Section 9's widow bench and Section 3's morning gift. That same practical tenderness appears at the door on departure day. A ribbon from the mantle is retied to a pilgrim staff. A loaf is wrapped, not for hunger alone, but as a letter from the oven. A kiss at the threshold is both blessing and inventory. Come back with your feet, your faith, and that silly hat you insist on calling a reliquary guard. Your first light joke bows to the sill. The hat is indeed a relique. Our regard, considering how many shrines the sky rains on. As the traveler steps away, the house rearranges itself around absence with the competence of a stagehand who knows the script. Calendars from Section 4 flip forward and get annotated with small stars. Market days, saint days, days to resharpen hope. The manuals from Section 5 lend language. Offer this week. Keep this fast. And the kitchen from Section 6 provides reinforcement in the form of soup and sleep. Sex becomes a memory practiced into future tense. A tenderness saved like coin for later spending. Historians still argue whether couples from humbler households could afford the time and expense of long pilgrimages. Many couldn't, which is why regional shrines thrive, and why proxy pilgrimages and local devotions substitute when necessary. Distance is elastic here. A mile to a wayside cross can be as grand as 1,000 to Santiago if the promise behind it is the same size. A curious tidbit rattles in a pouch with the traveler's breadcrumbs. Some households exchange prayer tallies, strings of knots or beads, so that each knot represents a daily remembrance. When one finger moves bead by bead, another hand far away mirrors the count, and suddenly the road is shorter than it looks. Later rosary traditions will formalize this. For now, the logic is already tenderly in place. A portable calendar of love. You pass a wayside in where the fire gestures everyone inward, and you catch fragments of stories that sound like Section 7's gray zones kept on a leash. Sailors brag gently. A merchant invents a saint for an extra blessing. A clerk swears he saw the thigh bone of a giant, and to be fair, he did see a very large cow. Amid the talk, a pilgrim ties his staff with a fresh scrap of cloth, a favor from home that smells faintly of the chest where winter linen sleeps. He will sleep better tonight because of it. Your second light joke adjusts the pack. Nothing beats a long road like a small towel with the smell of your own cupboard. Back at the door, the partner who stays invents rites of presence. One candle lit at Compline as if it were a porch light for the whole map. Bread sliced with the good knife on saints' days. The dog told the same story every evening, because dogs are liturgists at heart. Sex is deferred, not dismissed. Its warmth shows up as maintenance, oiled hinges, a repaired stool, a letter drafted to be handed over the moment a messenger with decent handwriting appears. Mainstream fact, pen and parchment lane. Letter writing exists, of course, but in many households it is rare and expensive. Messages travel by mouth, by token, by timing. A pilgrim badge, a tin scallop from Compostela, a lead ampulla from Canterbury, arrives before the traveler does, carried by a faster courier or a returning group. The badge is proof and promise both. The vow was kept. The road is closing behind the feet that made it. Remember the glove language from Section 2 and the tokens in Section 8 that became evidence in court. The road's language is similar, but kinder. A pouch of spice from a fair far off is a scented footnote to fidelity. A small coin with a foreign saint is a round sermon on perseverance. Even a stone tucked from a certain gate is a lock of hair in geological form. These tokens do not brag, they reconcile. Historians still argue whether pilgrim sexuality was carefully policed or simply monitored by the discouraging presence of blisters. Regulations exist, segregated lodgings, admonitions about modesty, sermons that assume people are people. But the daily exhaustion of the road is an excellent chaperone. The companionship that grows is often practical and loyal. Shoes checked, blisters bandaged, stories traded like bread. A curious tidbit joins the path with a soft step. Some travelers wear bells on hats or staffs, not just to announce pilgrim, but to make a sound in lonely stretches. At home, a partner may keep a small bell on a hook by the hearth and nudge it once at dusk. The result is an orchestra of faith played by two people in different rooms. You crest a hill and see a shrine town smoking with dinners and commerce. Stalls sell badges, churches sell candles, hostels sell sleep. The ritual is well practiced. Confession, mass, veneration, a long look at the reliquary, the prayer that begins with words and ends with a sigh. The sigh is the truest part, honest about the ache that brought the feet here. Sex doesn't vanish from this frame. It is simply content to be a quiet sibling of devotion, the promise to return and the promise to return kindly. Mainstream fact, household ledger. Vows often have material clauses, alms to be given, a donation to the parish, a repair to be made, and the returning traveler becomes a benefactor of small improvements. A new bench in church, a fixed roof tile, a candle that burns longer than strictly necessary. The house adopts these improvements like adopted cousins. Gratitude is architecture. Remember section 3's curtain that learned how to be a wall and a wing. Homecoming turns curtain into wing on purpose. The bed that was a hospital and a calendar becomes a harbor. Sex returns not as spectacle, but as confirmation. The world is big, this room is ours. Your third light joke softly arranges a pillow. After a month on straw pallets, the most romantic phrase is, "I beat the mattress and found only 2 peas." Historians still argue whether prolonged abstinence in separation heightened intimacy or frayed it. Diaries are scarce. Songs are biased. Court records are noisy. Yet the pattern that does survive is stubbornly hopeful. Households that practice tokens, calendars of prayer, and shared chores on return tend to reknit without tearing. The trick is not dramatic reunion, but humble continuation. The same kettle, the same joke about the stubborn shutter, the same 2 cups. A curious tidbit ringing like a small bell. Some families keep journey bread even after the traveler returns, small rounds baked on certain days, broken with a brief prayer for other households still on the road. Tradition grows a tail this way. Homes become way stations for invisible companions. Hospitality stretches, as it always does, from table to bed, translating into the nightly work of kindness. Night thickens. You cross the threshold into the same room where Section 1 began. Rushes soft as a quiet river, a hearth with a cat's purr, bread thinking about tomorrow's crust. The circle is not a loop, it's a spiral, a pattern revisited at a deeper level. You have seen courtship become contract, contract become choreography, choreography become care. You have watched rules try to be kind, and households succeed at it more often than they get credit for. You have seen sex fold itself willingly into the patient grammar of survival, then unfold into laughter when the calendar turns green. You keep one more promise to the format we've held all this way. A debate line aired gently, because the room prefers diplomacy. Historians still argue whether the Middle Ages were stricter or softer than our stereotypes allow, whether sermons ruled beds or beds quietly edited sermons. The answer is that homes, not headlines, decide tone, and homes favored tenderness, because tenderness fixes more leaks than outrage. The mini-thesis comes home with you and sets down its pack. Vows are journeys, tokens are maps, and endurance is the kindly muscle that lets love and sex become ordinary without becoming dull. Ordinary is the praise word here. It means the house kept itself together, even when the road asked for a share of its heart. The house grows quieter, as if the beams have exhaled and the shutters have sighed themselves into place. And there is a sweetness now in the air that is part warm bread and part candle wax. The kind of scent that tells the body it has permission to loosen its grip on the day and let the edges soften, because the floors are swept and the water bucket is full, and the last log has caught well enough to glow rather than flame. And as you stand in that glow, which settles along your shoulders like a shawl you didn't know you were wearing, you can feel the long line of stories we have walked through threading themselves together. Not tightly, not insistently, but with the relaxed strength of twine that has found the right weight to carry. And it becomes easy, almost natural, to let your breathing fall into step with the slow rhythm of the room. You can picture, if you want, the old tokens resting where they belong. A glove folded into a chest, a ribbon still guarding a corner of the mantel, a smooth sleep stone cooling at the foot of the bed as if it, too, is relieved to be off duty. And that picture suggests another, softer picture of pathways through fields at dusk that lead invariably toward warm places where someone remembers which cup is yours. And as the pathway lengthens in your mind, it also becomes shorter, because every step is familiar, every gate is easy, every small sound, the dog's sigh, the pot's settling click, the low shuffle of straw, arrives with a meaning that requires no words. This is the time for long sentences, the kind that carry without hurrying, the kind in which even the commas feel like friendly hands that guide without gripping. And if you listen to them closely, you will notice that they are saying very simple things. That the day did what it could, that the night will take it from here. That kindness belongs to both. And that rest is not an interruption of the story, but the part that lets the story keep being kind. And while you hear that, your breath finds its own comfortable pace, and the bed receives you as if it has been practicing this welcome all along, which of course it has. So let the room dim a little more, the last light slipping into the corners as if to check that everything is in order, and then leaving them to their own quiet secrets. Let your shoulders sink, and your jaw, and even the small muscle. Ease around your eyes that work so hard at reading faces and horizons. Allow the curtain in your mind to tilt toward a gentle close, not to hide anything, only to make a private space where sleep and safety can decide their own order of arrival. And if a final thought comes, make it an easy one, like a hand settling over a hand. A promise that doesn't need to say its words out loud, because the house has learned them already, and the house, like you, is ready to rest.